change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And so now Paul here, he's standing in the same place where all the great debates occurred in this city of Athens. It's the same place where all the great philosophers spoke, the people like Socrates, who had spoken in this same exact place, probably about 450 years before this, where the Areopagus is on the highest hill of Athens. It's right below the Parthenon building, and it's known as Mars Hill. And Paul, he's not on trial here, but the council, they just want Paul to present his new teaching. And there was a time where the Areopagus, it had 24 members, but now they only have 12 members. And Paul, he can't speak to these Greeks the way that he speaks to the Jews, because he can't take them to the scriptures and prove that Jesus is the Christ. Because these men, they're pagans. They don't know the scripture. So Paul, he has to build a bridge to them to be able to make his case. And so he has to start from a place that they can understand. And so Paul, he begins to speak to them about religion in general. And he starts his address by giving them a compliment. And he says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you're very religious." And then he brings up something he found when he was walking around as a tourist, when he was going around and reading all the shrines. And he tells them about this altar he found to the unknown God. And there actually was a lot of shrines to the unknown God. And their purpose was for them to cover any god that they had missed, because the Athenians, they didn't want to miss any gods. They didn't want to offend any of them. And there's a story about this unknown God and how it came about, and that it was about 600 years before Paul arrived in Athens. They had this great plague. And there was this man named Epidemes who had this idea to set a flock of sheep free in the city of Athens. And then anywhere where one of those sheep laid down, he took that sheep and he sacrificed it to the god where it laid. And if there was no god where the sheep laid down, he sacrificed that sheep to the unknown God. And that's when the plague stopped. And so now Paul, what he's going to do is he's going to proclaim this unknown God to them, and he's going to proclaim him as the creator. And by Paul proclaiming this to the Epicureans, who are atheists, who say that all matter is matter and it's always been matter, they don't believe in creation. And then you have the Stoics there who says that everything is God and God didn't create anything. And Paul is telling them that this unknown God made the world and everything in it. That this God is not a part of his creation, that he's not imprisoned by his creation, that he's distinct from creation, that he's separate from it, where this God is too great to be locked into a temple made by man, where a man couldn't build a temple big enough for him. And so what Paul is basically saying with his very first sentence is the opposite view of pantheism. So Paul, he's destroying their view of the real God living in any temple or needing any person to serve him. Where these pagans in Athens, they spent their whole time serving these man-made gods. They were going around giving them food and giving them drinks. That's what they spent their days doing. And so here you got Paul, and he's saying this from the Areopagus, where there's actually 3 shrines to Athena. And then he tells them that this is all foolishness. And then he tells them, instead of man serving the gods, it's really God who serves man. That it's God who is the one who's self-sufficient, where he needs nothing from man, where there's nothing that a man can do in a temple that can add anything to God. But it's God who gives us what we need, and he gives us life and breath. Where God, he not only gives us life, but then he sustains that life. Where the Greeks, they believed that their gods were these distant beings who didn't care a thing about them, that they didn't care anything about any of man's problems. But then Paul goes on to tell them that the unknown God created all men from one flesh, that all people descended from one man, and that all nations, that they share the same blood. Where these Athenians, what they believed they were the master race, and that they were superior to all the races. And they didn't even just think they were better than all the other nations. They believed they were even superior to all the other Greeks, because that's what polytheism believed. They believed that the different races came from different gods. And then Paul tells them that even their precious little Greece was a gift from God, that God had created the nation's boundaries and their histories, and that he pre-appointed times for the rise and the fall of nations, and that God had done all of this in hope that they would seek him and find him, because he's not very far away from any of us. So he's not like these gods on Mount Olympus or on some other planet, but that it's only in him that we live and have our being, that our life isn't independent from God. And then Paul, he quotes two other poets. And one of them is Epidemius, who is that guy that offered all those sheep to the unknown God in 600 BC. And then Aratus from 310 BC, where he says, "For we are also his offspring." And Paul here, he's not calling all men the children of God, but he's confirming the fatherhood of God in a natural sense, that all men were created in the image of God, in the sense that Adam was a son of God, and that all their ideas about God are wrong, that God is not like art. He's not like gold or silver or stone. He's not like one of their idols, that their idols, they don't represent God at all, and that it's foolish for man to make gods in man's image, because it was God who made man in his image. Where Paul, he's standing there and he's boldly telling them all that their religion, with all their gods and temples, their idols, with all their rituals, that it's all foolishness. And then he concludes by telling them that God has been patient with man's sin and his ignorance for centuries, and that he's held back his wrath, even though man was guilty, that God overlooked it. And now times are different, and Paul tells them that God is now commanding them to repent. And they actually know what this word means, because it's the Greek word metanoia, which means to change your mind. Because God was coming to judge the world in righteousness, and Paul tells them about the man that God ordained to do all this, and that the proof of that this is true is that God raised this man from the dead. And you don't see Paul mentioning Jesus' name here in our text, but we do know that he had already mentioned Jesus, because that's why he was called to the Areopagus, because they wanted to hear about Jesus and the resurrection. So this resurrection of the dead, that was a hard idea for these Greeks to accept, because they thought of the body of being a prison, and they thought that the sooner you leave your body, the happier you're going to be. And then to raise the body, for it to live again, that just didn't sit right with them, because they believed in the immortality of the soul, and they did believe in an afterlife, but they didn't believe in a bodily resurrection, because their thought was that material things were evil. So that means the body was evil. And so these guys were just a bunch of body shamers. They believed the spirit was good, and so they think, well, why would you clutter the spirit up with a body? Where they had no concept of a glorified body. But the truth is there is no good news without Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and that you can't know God without believing these things, believing in Jesus. And so there's a lot of these guys. What they do? They heard this and they mocked Paul. But then there were others of them, they wanted to hear more. But there was a few of them that actually believed and were saved. And one of them was one of these 12 council members, because he's named here, Dionysius, the Areopagite, who's named after that place where Paul's speaking. And then it mentions another woman, Damaris, who we know nothing about. And then it just says there was a few others. So Paul, he didn't have the big results that he had in Berea or Thessalonica, But we also don't hear of Paul being kicked out of town after speaking. But this response that Paul received here, it's actually not much different than the responses that we receive when we share Christ with non-believers, where people, they'll mock us because they'll think it's silly. They'll think there is no resurrection. They don't believe in the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus. And then you got all these other kind of people. They're just procrastinators. They've heard it and they go, well, I don't want to really commit to this. I'm gonna wait. I'm listening. I hear what you're saying. Where they say they want to hear more, but usually those people, they've already heard enough to make a commitment. They're just putting it off. But then you have a few people who actually believed. And some people, they criticize Paul here because Paul didn't preach the cross. I have no criticism of Paul here. I believe that Paul is in a very hard room. These are very hard people to reach. But it is true when Paul, he goes to Corinth, because he speaks about it in his letters to the Corinthians, that all he speaks in Corinth is the cross. And that may be because of the small response that he got in Athens, where Paul, he tells us, he says that the cross is foolishness to the Gentiles that are perishing. But we'll see next week that it'll produce a lot of life in Corinth. So last week, we saw Paul in Athens, and he was speaking at the Areopagus, which is Mars Hills, by invitation, a place that he never dreamed he would have ever been able to speak at. And it's not just because it's the place where the greatest presentations of thought were discussed, because it was the greatest auditorium in the whole world, where he got to present Jesus Christ before these influential men of Athens, where he didn't have big results. And though the people of Athens had an interest in hearing Paul, they thought they were too intelligent and too smart to believe what he said, where they were too well educated in their various philosophies, so they were unwilling to hear the truth, and being so entrenched in their idols that there was only a couple people who responded. So now Paul, he leaves the greatest city that he's ever been to so far, and he leaves it where this is the only city where he has not planted a church or he's appointed any elders. And so he's not leaving Athens on a high note, and he's probably feeling like a failure. And so now he travels 50 miles to the north to Corinth, where Athens, they had a population of 50,000 people, being a university town. But now Paul's going to a city that's 10 times bigger, with 200,000 Roman citizens and 500,000 Roman slaves. And so I would imagine that he's probably feeling like, why bother? Because if you can't make it in Athens, how are you ever going to make it here in Corinth? Where Corinth, it was a lot like Athens, it was just bigger. But they both served the same idols. They both had the same kind of philosophies with pagan temples everywhere. But Corinth, it didn't have a refined culture. Corinth was much nastier, where it made preaching in Athens like Paul was preaching in church. So why even try here? Where Corinth's main deity was Poseidon, but the deity that Corinth was really famous for was the goddess Aphrodite, who is also known as Venus, the goddess of the earth, where up on a plateau on this hillside overlooking 1,700 feet above the city of Corinth, they built a temple to this goddess Aphrodite, and where it was filled with 1,000 female prostitutes with other male prostitutes who would descend every night on the city, applying their trade with all their proceeds going to the temple, where most of these girls were bought at the slave market, and then they were donated to the temple by the wealthy patrons. So this is a lot like sex trafficking, but it's legal here, where it wasn't looked down upon at all, where these women were actually paid by the city of Corinth. And Corinth was a very wealthy city. And what made them so wealthy is that they had two harbors, where Corinth was an isthmus, which is this long, narrow peninsula, but it connects two land masses with water on both sides. Where on one side of Corinth was the Adriatic Sea, and on the other side, it was the Aegean Sea. So all trade and all travel, it all went through Corinth. Because going through the Isthmus of Corinth, you only had to go like 3.5 miles, where it was only 3.5 miles wide. Where at one time, the Emperor Nero, he tried to build this canal from one side of Corinth to the other to connect the two seas, but he wasn't able to accomplish it. But that canal is there today, but it was only completed about 100 years ago. But what they did have in Paul's day is they had this paved road connecting the two seas. And so for smaller ships, they would unload them and then they would tie them up with ropes and they would drag that ship to the other sea, rolling it on top of logs. And with the larger ships, all they would do is they would just unload the cargo, and then they would take the cargo over that 3.5 miles to the ships on the other sea, where this not only saved them time from sailing, but they didn't have to sail around this part of Greece. So it kept them from having to sail this very treacherous area, especially during the winter months. And it kept them from having to sail in the open seas. So that means that everyone in the Roman Empire, they passed through Corinth. Where the Corinth Isthmus was so famous, they also had the Isthmus Games, which was only second to the Olympics. But it was just like the Olympics, it was just not as famous. But this was a very hard town to live in. It's kind of like living in New York City. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Where one ancient writer said that Corinth was a town where only the tough could survive, because this was the original sin city, known for hedonism and immorality. And the term to be a Corinthian companion, well, that meant to be a prostitute. Or in the classical Greek, where it says to act like a Corinthian, that just meant you were a fornicator. Where in every Greek or Roman play, if you were to play the Corinthian, that means you were always portrayed being drunk. And so this, to me, is how it looked back in the 60s and 70s, like with people like Dean Martin in the Playboy generation, that you're always drunk with a cigarette hanging out of your mouth and you're chasing women. And here you have a whole city of them. They're all living like they're living in Hugh Hefner's Playboy mansion. And in 146 BC, Corinth, they rebelled against Rome. And so Rome, they came and they destroyed the city of Corinth. And it stayed that way for over 100 years until Julius Caesar had the city rebuilt. And then once it was rebuilt, it just became the same city it had always been. It became Sin City and a city of trade. But this was the second most important city in the Roman Empire because it had an important military outpost. And so now you have Paul here, and he's all alone because Timothy and Silas, they're still back in Berea. But God, he doesn't leave Paul alone long. And it says that Paul found a certain Jew named Aquila who was from Pontus. Now, Pontus is in northern Turkey on the coast of the Black Sea. So this Aquila, he's not close to his home. And he's in Corinth with his wife Priscilla. And you just have to notice that their names are just too cute. They match. It's like Barry and Sherry and Haley and Bailey or Danny and Annie. You have this Aquila and Priscilla. And now we know that Aquila, that he's a Jew. But we don't know if Priscilla was born a Jew or if she was just a converted Jew from marriage, because that name Priscilla is derived from the name Prisca. And Prisca was one of the greatest socialite families in Rome. It was a name from high society, where she was probably related to that family somehow. And when you read 2 Timothy 4:19, Paul, he actually calls her Prisca. And it seems like Aquila and Priscilla, that they were Christians when they met Paul. So they may have come from the Roman church in Rome, which was a church that Paul didn't plant. Where at this time, Paul, he had never been to Rome because he had mentioned that he wanted to go see them when he wrote his letter to the Romans, where that letter to the Romans was actually written by Paul from Corinth. And so when you see Paul and he's describing all the sins of the Gentile lifestyle that he writes in his letter to the Romans, you know that Paul, that he's seeing this lifestyle played out every day in front of him in Corinth. But if Aquila and Priscilla, if they weren't Christians when they came to Corinth, they became Christians quickly after they met Paul, where the only reason the couples in Corinth is that they were kicked out of Rome with the other 20,000 Jews there. And that's because the Emperor Claudius commanded all the Jews to leave Rome because of the uprisings by the Jews in Rome. And it's believed by some that those uprisings occurred because of Jesus being introduced into some of the synagogues in the city of Rome. And this expulsion of the Jews, it came about in 49 AD. And it was all because of these constant riots. But the information about the riots and why they were kicked out, it's not very clear. So we don't have a real clear picture. But Paul, he joins these other Jewish tent makers, which means that they're all workers in leather. Although in Tarsus, they also had black goat hair cloth tents, and Tarsus is the city where Paul's from. So now you have Paul, and he's working with his hands so that he can support himself in ministry. And so this would stop anyone from accusing Paul of seeking converts for cash, that he was not in this for the money, like the false prophets were. Where in Judaism, the teachers, they never received money from their students. And that's why the father of a teacher, that he always taught their sons a trade so that they would be able to help support themselves. Where Gamaliel said, if you don't teach your son a trade, you teach him to be a thief. And there would have been a lot of demand for tents in Corinth because of all the people coming into town, especially around the times of the Isthmus Games. And then there were always sailors coming into the port. But Paul, he doesn't only just work with this lovely couple, but he also lives with them, where Aquila and Priscilla, they become these indispensable partners in his ministry, where they actually end up having a church in their home. And we'll see throughout Paul's life, he will have contact with them till the end of his life, where in Paul's very last letter, the very last letter he ever wrote, which was to Timothy, where in 2 Timothy at the very end, at the very last chapter, in chapter 4, which is only written months before he was beheaded by Nero, Priscilla and Aquila, they're the very last people he says hi to, which is really him saying goodbye. Where at that time, he'd already known this couple for 15 years. And so what they did is they worked all week making tents, and then on the Sabbath, they would go to the synagogue to persuade Jews and Greeks about Jesus. And there is an inscription that had been found in Corinth that confirms that they did have a synagogue of the Hebrews. And then we finally have Timothy and Silas show up. And then they bring Paul this really good news about Thessalonica, that this church is going strong. Where Paul here, he responds to that news and he immediately writes the Thessalonian church a letter, which is the first letter to the Thessalonians, which is actually what we're studying on Wednesday nights. And he wrote this to encourage them because if you remember, Paul, he only had 3 weeks before he was forced out of Thessalonica. And actually in Corinth, he writes both of his letters to the Thessalonians, also along with that letter to the Romans. And we know from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians that Timothy, that he also brought Paul financial support from the Philippian church. So now Paul, he can set aside his tent making for a while and he can minister full-time building the church in Corinth, where Paul, he does this by teaching at the synagogue. And it's here where it says that Paul is being compelled to do this by the Spirit.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,